Mei Wong stared at her reflection in the polished crystalline walls of the Galactic University of Advanced Sciences, still unable to believe she'd made it here. The prestigious institution floated serene the Arcturus sector, its gleaming spires and impossible architecture a testament to the combined knowledge of over 300 sentient species. Well, 301 now, if you counted humans, which most of the faculty and students emphatically did not. "Excuse me," Primitive chirped an 8-limbed Xerxian student, deliberately bumping into her with at least 3 of its appendages. "Oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot your species hasn't mastered basic spatial awareness yet." Mei adjusted her slightly crooked uniform and bit back the urge to point out that the Xerxian's accidental collision had been precisely calculated to knock her off balance while maintaining plausible deniability. Instead, she smiled sweetly and said, "No problem. We humans do have a saying, though, 3 strikes, and you're out, though I suppose with 8 limbs, you'd get 8 strikes, right?" The Xerxian's chromatophores flickered in confusion as it tried to pass whether it had just been insulted. Mei used the moment to slip past and hurry toward her xenoarchaeology class, her footsteps echoing through the gravity-controlled corridors. She was already cutting it close, and Professor Zixtal had made it abundantly clear that primitive time-keeping abilities would not be accepted as an excuse for tardiness. The classroom itself was a marvel of alien engineering, a perfect hemisphere with seats arranged in concentric circles, each at a precise angle to accommodate the various physiologies of the student body. Mei's seat, naturally, was in the very back row, despite her consistently being in the top 1% of test scores. Something about maintaining optimal viewing angles for evolved species, according to the administration. "Ah, our token Homo sapiens arrives," Professor Zixtal's voices resonated through the chamber. The Tritonian professor's 3 heads spoke in perfect harmony, each adding a subtle layer of condescension to the words. "Please try not to shed any epidermis cells today, they clog our air purification systems." Scattered tentacles and appendages wiggled in approximate alien equivalent of snickering. Mei took her seat, pulling out her ancient paper notebook, another source of constant amusement to her classmates with their psychically linked quantum datapads. But there was something about the feel of pencil on paper that helped her think, even if it marked her as hopelessly archaic. Today, all 3 of Professor Zixtal's heads announced, their bioluminescent crests pulsing with academic excitement, "We begin our study of the greatest unsolved mystery in xenoarchaeological history." The professor's middle head smiled smugly at the class, while the other 2 maintained their usual look of vague disappointment with the universe in general. Mei watched as Tilara, the professor's star pupil, straightened all 4 of her spinal ridges in anticipation. The Centaurian had made it her personal mission to remind Mei daily that humans had barely mastered faster than light travel, while her species had been building quantum civilizations for millennia. But first, Professor Zixtal's left head interjected, "Let us review the fundamental principles of advanced civilizations and their artifact patterns. Ms. Wong, since you represent a developing species, perhaps you can tell us at what technological level a civilization typically develops efficient waste management systems." It was a trap question. Everyone knew Earth was still struggling with environmental issues. Mei smiled brightly and responded, "That's fascinating, Professor. Actually, I was just reading about how the Great Tritonian Empire had to evacuate their first 3 homeworlds due to toxic accumulation before they figured out recycling. The historical records suggest it took them about twice as long as humans to develop basic sewage treatment." The professor's middle head turned a fascinating shade of mauve, while the other 2 seemed to be choking on their own mandibles. The class fell into a shocked silence, broken only by a hastily suppressed giggle from Kruvix, a shy Andromedan who had once confided in Mei that he found human directness refreshing. "Yes, well, the professor's 3 heads finally managed to synchronize again. Let us move on to today's actual topic. Though perhaps Ms. Wong would benefit from a remedial course in xenopolitical etiquette." Mei dutifully made a note in her primitive paper notebook, complete with a little doodle of the professor's 3 heads, all wearing different expressions of constipation. She had learned early on that sometimes the best way to handle the constant condescension was to document it for her upcoming memoir, My Year Among the Advanced Species: A Human's Guide to Galactic Academia. Besides, she had a feeling today's mystery would be worth all the casual xenoism she had to endure. There was something in the way the professor's bioluminescence was pulsing that suggested this wasn't going to be just another lecture about how humans were barely more evolved than space algae. She was right, but she had no idea just how right she was about to be. Professor Zextal's central head beamed while the other two maintained their scholarly frowns as a shimmering force field lowered from the ceiling. Inside, rotating slowly in the artificial gravity field, was what appeared to be a perfect cube approximately 30 centimeters on each side. Its surface gleamed with an iridescent sheen that somehow managed to look both metallic and organic at the same time. Behold, all three heads proclaimed in unison, the Rithar cube. The class erupted in gasps and excited chittering. Even T. Lara's spinal ridges quivered with anticipation. May noticed Kruvix's tentacles had tied themselves into what she'd learned was the Andromedan equivalent of excited knots, for the benefit of our less advanced colleague. The professor's right head said with a pointed look at May, "This is perhaps the most significant xenoarchaeological find of the last millennium. The cube was discovered in the ruins of the Rithar civilization, a species so advanced they had mastered dimensional engineering before most races had discovered fire," the left head added smugly, which, I believe, was around the time humans were still debating whether the wheel was just a passing fad. May kept her face carefully neutral as she studied the cube. It was beautiful, she had to admit. Its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, but maintained its rigid cubic shape. Across each face were intricate patterns that seemed to change every time you looked away, or rather, she realized, every time you thought you looked away. The cube has resisted all attempts at analysis for over 1,000 years, the professor continued. Our most advanced quantum scanning technology cannot penetrate its surface. Psychic probes bounce off it. Even attempting to analyze it at the subatomic level has proved problematic. The middle head grimaced. The Proxima Institute lost an entire research wing trying that approach. Apparently, the cube objected. Current theory suggests it's a repository of the entire Rithar knowledge base. T. Lara chimed in, her voice dripping with academic smugness. But accessing it would require an intelligence level approaching that of the Rithar themselves. She flicked a dismissive glance at May. Some species present may want to cover their sensory organs for this discussion. We wouldn't want to overwhelm any primitive neural structures. Indeed, Professor Zixtal's left head nodded approvingly, while the right added, though Ms. Wong is welcome to observe. Consider it an educational experience in what actual advanced problem-solving looks like. The professor waved one of his 12 limbs, and a holographic display materialized, showing previous attempts to crack the cube's secrets. Nye watched, fascinated, as the greatest minds in the galaxy tried increasingly complex approaches. The quantum collective of Betelgeuse had attempted to solve it by running simultaneous equations in 15 dimensions. The hive mind of Rigel had devoted a century to psychically communing with it. The mechanical synths of Tau Ceti had spent decades trying to brute force every possible mathematical combination of its shifting patterns. The patterns you observe. The professor explained, all three heads speaking in a reverent whisper, are actually 5-dimensional quantum fluctuations expressing themselves in our limited 3-dimensional space. The leading theory, proposed by Dr. N.X. Clacks of the Sirius Academy, suggests that the patterns are actually— Excuse me, Professor May raised her hand, earning various looks of annoyance from her classmates. But has anyone tried just touching it? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual background hum of the university's quantum engines seemed to pause in embarrassment. I apologize, the professor's middle head said slowly, while the other two performed the Tritonian equivalent of an eye roll. I sometimes forget that some species haven't grasped the concept of obvious death wishes. The cube's surface temperature fluctuates between absolute zero and the core temperature of a minor sun. Touching it would be inadvisable. But how do we know that May persisted, earning more hostile glares? The readings show the temperature variations, but has anyone actually verified them physically? Because these patterns, she squinted at the cube, they remind me of something. Oh, this should be enlightening. T. Lara's spinal ridges vibrated with sarcastic anticipation. Please, share with us what profound insights your species, which still thinks quantum entanglement is spooky action at a distance, has gleaned from looking at an artifact that has puzzled the greatest minds in the galaxy for a millennium. The professor's heads shared an amused look. While we appreciate your enthusiasm, Ms. Wong, perhaps we should return to actual scientific discussion. Now, as I was saying about Dr. NX Clax's theory. But May wasn't listening anymore. She was too busy watching the patterns shift and flow across the cube's surface. There was something familiar about them, something that reminded her of long hours spent in her grandfather's workshop back on Earth. The way the patterns moved, the subtle shifts in the seemingly random changes. She gasped softly as realization struck her. The entire class turned to stare at her again, but this time she didn't care. She knew what she was looking at, and more importantly, she knew why 1,000 years of the galaxy's greatest minds had failed to solve it. They had been thinking far too hard about it. "Professor," she said, raising her hand again, "I would like to request permission to examine the artifact." The three heads blinked in perfect synchronization. "MS," Wong the middle head said slowly, as if explaining quantum physics to a particularly dense rock. "I don't think you quite understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," May replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I understand exactly what I'm looking at, and I think I know how to open it." The entire class erupted in what could only be described as multilingual, multi-species chaos. T. Lara's spinal ridges were practically doing the wave, and several Xerxian students had tied their limbs into knots of disbelief. Professor Zixtal's three heads were having an argument with each other in rapid-fire Tritonian, which Mai's universal translator was struggling to keep up with, though she distinctly caught phrases like impossible, preposterous, and something that translated roughly as humans still think binary computing is impressive. But May's attention remained fixed on the cube, her mind drifting back to humid summer afternoons in her grandfather's workshop in Singapore. The old man had been a collector and restorer of antique puzzle boxes, particularly those from the Ming and Qing dynasties. She could still smell the mix of wood polish and machine oil, still hear his patient voice as he guided her hands over intricate mechanisms. "The clever fool builds puzzles no one can solve," his words echoed in her memory. "The wise craftsman builds puzzles that seem simple once you know the trick." She studied the cube's shifting patterns, a smile tugging at her lips. The aliens had been looking at it all wrong, literally. They'd been so focused on quantum mechanics and five-dimensional mathematics that they'd missed something fundamentally simple. The patterns weren't random at all. They were reactive. Like grandfather's favorite puzzle box, she muttered to herself, earning concerned looks from nearby students who probably thought she was having some sort of primitive mental breakdown. That particular box had taken her 3 months to figure out. It had seemed impossible at first, panels that shifted randomly, patterns that made no sense. Until she realized that the random shifts were actually responding to the oils in human skin, to temperature and pressure. The box wasn't meant to be solved by looking at it or analyzing it. It had to be touched, had to be felt. MS. Wong, Professor Zixtal's middle head, interrupted her thoughts while the other two continued bickering. "Perhaps you'd care to share with the class what exactly makes you think you can solve something that has baffled the greatest minds in the galaxy for a millennium." May straightened in her seat, trying not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, surrounded by beings who could manipulate quantum states with their minds, who had mastered interdimensional travel, who considered her species barely more evolved than space plankton, and they had completely overthought this. "Professor," she said carefully, "what if the Rithar weren't actually testing for advanced scientific knowledge? What if they were testing for something else entirely?" The class fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, the kind that happens when someone suggests something so outrageous that nobody quite knows how to respond. "Back on Earth," she continued, warming to her theory, "we have a long history of puzzle boxes. Some of them are quite simple, others incredibly complex. But the best ones, the ones that last for generations, all share one thing in common: they're interactive. They're meant to be handled, to be explored through touch and intuition." She pointed at the cube's shifting surface. "Look at those patterns. Really look at them. They're not random quantum fluctuations, they're following the attention of observers. Watch." She focused intently on one corner of the cube, and sure enough, the patterns began to swirl more actively in that area. "Impossible," T. Lara scoffed, but May noticed her spinal ridges weren't quite so rigid anymore. The Rithar were masters of quantum engineering. They wouldn't create something so primitive, wouldn't they? May countered, her confidence growing. "Think about it. If you wanted to create a test that would truly identify civilizations worth sharing your knowledge with, would you make it dependent on technological advancement? Any species can eventually develop enough processing power to brute force a solution. But understanding the value of simplicity, of hands-on exploration," she grinned. That takes wisdom. The patterns on the cube seemed to pulse more actively now, as if responding to her words. Or maybe, she realized with growing excitement, responding to her intent. Just like her grandfather's puzzles, just like the ancient boxes that had fascinated humanity for centuries, it wasn't about having the right technology or the most advanced theories. It was about having the right approach. Sometimes her grandfather's voice whispered in her memory as she studied the seemingly impossible artifact. The most advanced thing you can do is admit that maybe there's value in being simple. May could feel the weight of alien eyes on her as she continued her examination. Some were skeptical, others curious, and a few like Crew Vix with his excited tentacle knots seemed genuinely intrigued. She tried to imagine how she must look to them, a primitive human, barely out of her species' planetary cradle, daring to suggest that she understood something they had missed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, the representative of a primitive species, suggesting that the solution to this ancient mystery might lie in an approach that the advanced species would consider beneath them. If she was wrong, she'd never live it down. Her name would become a cautionary tale in xenoarchaeology classes for centuries. Remember the human who thought she could solve the Rithar cube by poking it. But she wasn't wrong. She couldn't be. The patterns were too familiar, too reminiscent of the puzzles she'd spent her childhood solving. The way they flowed and shifted, responding to observation and attention, it was exactly like the quantum-enhanced finishing on her grandfather's prized Ming Dynasty puzzle box, just on a much grander scale. "Professor," she said, rising from her seat with determination, "I know this sounds crazy, but I think the Rithar weren't looking for the most advanced civilization to share their knowledge with." She took a deep breath, knowing her next words would either make history or make her the laughingstock of the galaxy. "I think they were looking for one that still remembered the value of a hands-on approach." The professor's three heads exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, the middle head spoke, "And you believe you can prove this theory?" May nodded, her eyes never leaving the cube. "Yes," she said simply, "I can. But first, I need to know something about those temperature readings you mentioned. Did your sensors actually measure the temperature, or did they just predict what it should be based on the energy signatures they detected?" The sudden awkward silence told her everything she needed to know. It was time to test her theory. The force field surrounding the Rithar cube hummed with barely contained energy as Professor Zixtal's three heads engaged in what appeared to be a heated internal debate. The rest of the class watched in horrified fascination as May stood patiently, hand raised like a student, asking to solve a basic algebra problem rather than requesting access to one of the most dangerous artifacts in known space. "You understand," the professor's middle head finally spoke, while the other two continued glaring at each other, "that if you're wrong, the best-case scenario is merely catastrophic failure. And the worst case," May asked, unable to resist. "The cube's quantum fluctuations could theoretically collapse into a localized singularity, taking this entire sector of space with it," the left head added helpfully, "though your primitive neural structure would be vaporized long before that, so you wouldn't have to witness the destruction." "How considerate," May muttered. Then, louder, "I'll take that risk. Besides," she added with a grin, "think how embarrassing it would be for an advanced species to have their entire sector destroyed by a primitive human." Tilara's spinal ridges practically vibrated with indignation. "Professor, you can't seriously be considering." "I am indeed considering it," all three heads answered in unison, which May had learned was a sign of absolute certainty in Tritonians. If only because the alternative is listening to another millennium of theories about quantum dimensional paradigm shifts. The force field flickered and disappeared. The cube hung suspended in the artificial gravity field, its patterns swirling more actively now, almost expectantly. "Any last words?" the professor's right head asked, with what might have been genuine concern. "Perhaps a primitive prayer to one of your Earth deities?" May approached the cube slowly, her mind racing back to every lesson her grandfather had ever taught her about puzzle boxes. "Just one thing," she said, studying the shifting patterns intently. "Has anyone ever noticed that these patterns move in exactly the same way as temperature-sensitive quantum ink?" Before anyone could respond, she reached out and placed her palm flat against the cube's surface. The entire class gasped. Several students dove under their desks. Tilara's spinal ridges went completely flat, the Centaurian equivalent of fainting. Professor Zixtal's three heads started reciting what sounded like a very complex mathematical equation, probably calculating the exact radius of their imminent destruction. But May didn't vaporize. The cube didn't collapse into a singularity. Instead, the patterns beneath her hand began to swirl and coalesce, responding to her body heat, just as she'd suspected they would. "Ha," she exclaimed triumphantly. "Grandfather was right, quantum mechanics or not. A puzzle box is still a puzzle box." What? How for the first time, all three of Professor Zixtal's heads seemed to be at a loss for words. "The temperature readings," May explained, watching as the patterns continued to shift under her touch. "They weren't actual measurements, were they? They were theoretical calculations based on the energy signatures your sensors detected. But you never actually tested the surface temperature directly because you assumed it would be deadly." She moved her hand slowly across the cube's surface, feeling for irregularities. The Rithar didn't create a quantum death trap. They created the galaxy's most sophisticated puzzle box, using the same basic principles we humans have been using for thousands of years, just with much better technology. The patterns were definitely responding now, forming complex geometric shapes that followed her touch. She could feel subtle variations in the surface, almost imperceptible raises and dips that reminded her of the magnetic locking mechanisms in her grandfather's most complex boxes. "Look," she said, pointing with her free hand. "These patterns aren't random quantum fluctuations. They're a guide showing you where to touch next, but only if you're actually in physical contact with the cube. The Rithar created a puzzle that could only be solved through direct interaction." The class had crept closer now, their fear giving way to fascination. Even Tilara's spinal ridges had perked up with reluctant interest. The shifting patterns May continued, her fingers dancing across the cube's surface, following the flowing guides. "They're like the grain in a wooden puzzle box. They show you the hidden mechanisms if you know how to read them. And these slight temperature variations." She closed her eyes, focusing entirely on touch. "They're marking the pressure points." "Impossible," Tilara whispered, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. The complexity of the quantum states alone would require exactly this kind of sophisticated technology. May finished for her, but the principle behind it, that's as old as curiosity itself. Every culture that's ever created puzzles has understood one fundamental truth: the best security system is one that only works if you approach it the right way. Her fingers found another pressure point, and she pressed gently. A harmonic tone filled the room, and new patterns began to emerge across the cube's surface. "It's a sequential lock," she explained, excitement building in her voice. "Just like the puzzle boxes I grew up with, but using quantum states instead of mechanical tumblers. Each correct touch creates a new pattern showing you where to touch next, but you can only see it if you're in direct contact with the surface." The professor had moved closer, all three heads watching intently as May continued to work. "But the mathematical complexity of predicting the correct sequence—" "That's just it," May interrupted, her fingers dancing faster now as she followed the flowing patterns. "You're not supposed to predict it. You're supposed to feel it, to interact with it. The Rithar created a test that could only be passed by a species willing to literally reach out and touch the unknown." The cube had begun to emit a soft, pulsing glow. The patterns were moving faster now, more purposefully, as if responding to her understanding as much as her touch. "One more sequence," she muttered, half to herself. "It's just like grandfather's favorite box. The final lock is always the simplest one. The one that proves you've truly understood the puzzle's nature." Her hands moved across all 6 faces of the cube in rapid succession, following the flow of patterns, pressing pressure points in a sequence that felt as natural as playing a familiar piece of music. The cube's glow intensified, and a series of harmonic tones filled the room, building to a crescendo. And then, with a sound like a perfectly tuned crystal being struck, the cube's surface began to transform. The entire class held their breath, or equivalent respiratory functions, as the seemingly solid surface of the cube started to fold in on itself in impossibly smooth movements. It was as if the metal itself had become liquid, flowing and reforming in a mesmerizing dance of geometry and light. May stepped back, a triumphant smile on her face, as the cube completed its transformation. Where there had been a simple geometric shape, there now floated something that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could process, yet somehow remained perfectly comprehensible to the human mind. "That," she said into the stunned silence, "is how you solve a puzzle box." Professor Zixtal's three heads were rapidly changing colors in what May recognized as the Tritonian expression of extreme academic excitement. But this defies every quantum theory we've developed. The mathematical models alone would require. Sometimes Mai quoted her grandfather, "The most advanced thing you can do is admit that maybe there's value in being simple." The cube had stabilized now, its new form gently rotating in the gravity field, ready to share whatever secrets the Rithar had deemed worthy of their test. Around her, the class had fallen into a silence so profound she could hear the quantum engines humming 19 decks below. She turned to face her classmates, unable to completely suppress her grin. So she said cheerfully, "Should we see what's inside?" The transformed cube projected a holographic display that filled the entire classroom. But instead of the expected repository of advanced quantum physics or interdimensional engineering secrets, it showed something that made every alien jaw or equivalent structure drop in astonishment. It was a simple message, written in what the universal translators rendered as perfectly clear text. "Congratulations on remembering that intelligence isn't just about complexity. Here's everything we learned about the universe, but more importantly, here's what we learned about learning itself." What followed was not just the scientific knowledge of the Rithar civilization, but their philosophy of discovery. Pages upon pages of insights appeared, showing how they had advanced not through brute computational force, but through understanding the fundamental simplicity underlying the universe's apparent complexity. "Unbelievable," Professor Zixtal's middle head whispered, while the other two were frantically taking notes. They weren't testing for technological advancement at all. They were testing for wisdom, May said softly, reading through the flowing text. The ability to step back from complexity and see the simple patterns underneath. She couldn't help adding, "Something my primitive grandfather taught me while fixing antique puzzle boxes." Tilara had moved closer, her spinal ridges now curved in what May recognized as the Centaurian expression of deep thought. But our quantum analysis, our multidimensional models, were all incredibly impressive, May finished for her, and completely missed the point. Sometimes the most advanced solution is knowing when not to use advanced technology. The Rithar data continued to flow, revealing centuries of accumulated knowledge. But what caught everyone's attention was their recurring philosophy. True advancement came not from building more complex systems, but from finding the elegant simplicity within complexity. "Really makes you think," Kruvix said, his tentacles forming contemplative spirals. "All this time we've been so focused on proving how advanced we are, we forgot to ask if we were being smart about it." Professor Zixtal's three heads had finally synchronized again. "Ms. Wong," they said together, "it appears we owe you, and perhaps humanity in general, an apology." "Oh, don't worry about it," May grinned. "We humans have a lot to learn about advanced technology, but maybe you all have something to learn about the value of staying hands-on with your work." 3 months later. The Journal of Xenoarchaeology's headline caused quite a stir across the galaxy. "Human methodology revolutionizes field. Sometimes simpler is smarter." May's solution to the Rithar cube had sparked a revolution in xenoarchaeological approaches. Teams across the galaxy were now combining advanced scanning technology with what they'd dubbed primitive intuitive methodology, though May noticed they said primitive, with a very different tone these days. The Gua's campus had changed too. Her seat in xenoarchaeology class had mysteriously moved to the front row, and she'd caught Tilara taking notes on her primitive but fascinating problem-solving methods. Even Professor Zixtal's three heads had developed a habit of nodding respectfully when she entered the room. But her favorite change was the new study group that met in her dorm room every week. Watching Tilara try to solve a traditional Chinese puzzle box while Kruvix offered increasingly confused suggestions was worth every moment of condescension she'd endured. "I still don't understand," Tilara said one evening, her spinal ridges contorted in frustration as she struggled with a particularly clever box. "How do you humans think of these solutions without running at least a basic quantum probability analysis?" May leaned back in her chair, enjoying the scene. "Maybe that's our secret advantage. When you can't rely on advanced technology, you have to develop other ways of understanding patterns." "But it's so simple," Tilara exclaimed, then paused as the box clicked open in her hands. Her spinal ridges straightened in surprise. "Oh, exactly," May smiled. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the complex answer, it's being willing to look for the simple one." Kruvix, who had finally managed to untie his tentacles from their excited knots, waved one appendage thoughtfully. You know, there's a rumor going around that the Archival Institute found 3 more Ritha artifacts last week. They're requesting a human consultant for the excavation team. Really, Mai raised an eyebrow. And here I thought humans weren't advanced enough for serious xenoarchaeology. Well, Tilara said, her spinal ridges forming what May now recognized as a sheepish curve. Perhaps we're learning that advanced doesn't always mean what we thought it did. As if to emphasize the point, the puzzle box in Tilara's hands clicked shut again, causing her to jump in surprise. May laughed and reached out to show her the trick once more, remembering her grandfather's words about wisdom and simplicity. The galaxy, it seemed, was finally ready to learn what humanity had known all along. Sometimes the best way to solve a puzzle isn't to calculate every possibility, it's to reach out and touch it with your own hands. And somewhere, she was sure, the Ritha was smiling at how long it had taken the galaxy's advanced species to figure that out.